You are listening to KZSA's Voces, Criticas, Critical Voices. I am your host, Silvana Falcone. Today I'm here with Elizabeth Currans, Associate Professor of Women's and Gender Studies at Eastern Michigan University, where she teaches courses in feminist, queer, performance, and disability studies. I've invited her to the show to discuss her new book titled Marching Dykes, Liberated Sluts, and Concerned Mothers, Women Activists Transforming Public Space, published by the University of Illinois Press. Congratulations, Beth, on your new book.
Thank you.
In this book, she explores how participants in public demonstrations organized and attended primarily by women claim and remake public spaces. Welcome, Beth, to KZSA's Voces Criticas.
Thank you so much for having me.
Your book starts us off by talking about your involvement in the 2004 anti-war protests in New York City regarding the U.S. bombing of Iraq from 2003. We actually have to note the year because there's been so many. And as part of larger protests against the RNC, you were arrested along with dozens of other people at this particular protest. Can you tell us what happened to you and your friends there and describe the experience of arrest for you?
There was a small group of us who had known each other in Santa Barbara, California, where we were all either grad students or undergraduate students. And so we had planned that we would all be there together and that we would take part in these protests. And they've been planning for months in New York for the protests. And I actually arrived first and attended some of the early meetings that were happening around the city. It was a big mobilization, kind of in the style of the 1999 World Trade Organization protests in Seattle, where different groups of people would independently organize what they were doing, but then there'd be kind of a simultaneous protest. The group of us from Santa Barbara chose to go to what was a street party, actually, just outside of Union Square. And this was one of a handful of the separate protests that were targeted by police. There was over 500 people arrested that day. And what happened for us was, the group of us moved out of Union Square, and when we realized we were surrounded by police in riot gear, holding this orange netting, the kind of netting you often see around construction areas. And the police did something that I now know is a specific tactic called kettling, where they surround you from all sides and just keep pushing in and pushing in and pushing in. And I remember I was somehow in the very back. I remember my body actually being lifted off the ground. We were packed in so tight that all the bodies were kind of lifting in the air. We were all interrogated separately, sitting on the sidewalk in small groups, not separately, but little groups were. And then once we were officially arrested, we were all put on buses and taken over to one of the piers along the Hudson River.
You were also part of this class action lawsuit resulting from this. So what happened there?
A couple of people decided to sue because nobody got out within 24 hours. A couple of people decided to put together a class action lawsuit. The National Lawyers Guild had represented all of us who were arrested and so kind of set up that class action lawsuit in 2014. So a little over a decade later, they decided in favor of those of us who were part of the class action. And in that settlement, I think the people who brought the claim got a larger settlement. The rest of us got $5,000 a decade later, but interestingly, very clearly does not hold the police liable.
It is so difficult, nearly impossible, really, to hold the police accountable for abuse. Now let's talk a bit about some of the terminology you use in your book, specifically feminist and activist. How did you come to decide on these terms, and what kind of tensions do you see emerging in your research by using these terms?
Yeah, in some ways I went into the project a little naively because I, of course, identify as both a feminist and an activist, and then I assumed that other people who did similar things that I did would also. In talking to people, both of those terms are really loaded. Even some of the people I interviewed were not necessarily comfortable with that term. And that was particularly notable when I interviewed people who are part of the Million Mom March, which is a gun control organization that is made up primarily of mothers who are thinking about the safety of their children. That's the reason that they're entering a public space and entering the public sphere is we're mothers, we're concerned about our children, we felt like we had to. These were folks who were more interested in, kind of a traditional respectability, and so are less likely to identify with either of those terms. In some ways, I think what was interesting to me in doing this work is I expected feminists to be controversial in certain circumstances. I was sometimes surprised when it was controversial. I would assume that people went to a Take Back the Night march would understand themselves as feminists. And that wasn't necessarily true. because I had young women say, well, the term feminist means man-hating. But yet they're out there talking about sexual violence, things that other people might perceive as feminist. I think I was surprised at how many people were uncomfortable with the term activist. And so that was part of a learning curve for me, particularly for people who were interested in more cultural respectability, like these mothers contesting gun laws. They wanted to be seen as volunteers. They wanted to be seen as someone who is doing something positive, and activists may well have seemed very threatening.
So besides the Million Mom March, what are the other protests that you focus on in the book? And how did you come to decide or pick these particular cases for your work?
So in the book, I have 7 key chapters that look at one demonstration. So there are slut walks, which is the most contemporary chapter, Take Back the Night marches, and both of those look at violence against women and how people are responding. Then there's dyke marches, Women in Black vigils, which are an anti-war vigil, and Code Pink direct actions. And then there are 2 national protests, one that you already mentioned, Million Mom March, and then the 2004 March for Women's Lives, which looks at reproductive rights. So I was interested in some ways in my own investment in things. Every Saturday I would go to an anti-war march as a graduate student, but also every year I would go to a Take Back the Night march and a dyke march. And I was really interested in thinking about why were we doing that? What did it mean to us? And then thinking in particular about why is it that gender and or sexuality are some of the reasons why people enter public spaces.
You were listening to Dr. Elizabeth Currans, Associate Professor of Women's and Gender Studies at Eastern Michigan University. She is the author of Marching Dykes, Liberated Sluts, and Concerned Mothers, Women Activists Transforming Public Space, published this year by the University of Illinois Press. As you discuss in your book, too often feminist stories are framed in a linear manner and in a progress type of narrative. What is the result of seeing feminist stories only in this framework of progress?
When I bring that up in the book, I was quite influenced by the work of Claire Hemmings, who wrote a book called The Stories We Tell, and it really analyzes how feminists talk about feminists. And what she notes is that there's a couple different dominant narratives. One is a progress and one is a loss narrative. And I think I've been very guilty of the progress narrative. Back in the 60s and 70s, they started some good stuff, but they had these big problems, and then we started to fix them, and we're way better now. But what that does is it ignores the complex work that was happening in the 60s and 70s and the 80s. And so it's easy for us to be like, they didn't do intersectionality, we do. They didn't accept trans people, and we do. But that not only undermines the complexity of what was happening then, it lets us off the hook. Acts like we already got it. And you know what? I don't think we do.
And I think the recent election blew up any image of feminist progress.
Right, or at least any simple understanding of feminist progress. As an example from the 2004 March for Women's Lives, I look at, 3 different people. One is a, 20-something white woman from Minneapolis who talks about stepping out of the subway with her husband and being absolutely overwhelmed with awe and just feeling so at home on the National Mall where there's, 1.15 million people gathered. And for her, it felt like, some kind of homecoming. And yet a young black woman from Atlanta experiences the same crowd to be like, she's like, where are all the other black people? She's like, I see white women and white women and white women. And then I found this section and where we were at, and there's a bunch of black people, and I was afraid we were in the people of color section. And then she says, okay, but once we started marching, things were better. But she never had that same joy, right? But this is the same march. It's also the same march as a young Asian American woman who walks with a distinct limp, felt like she couldn't navigate the mall because she had a rented wheelchair and people wouldn't move for her. And so she was glad to be there, right? But yet she couldn't really march, and her frustration was as much with the other people there as the organizers who hadn't thought about the fact that the gravel and grass was not going to work for a wheelchair. So that's the same march. When I talk to students about that, they want to totally dismiss the first one I give. And I understand that we want to identify with people for whom it was more complicated, but I think we can't leave aside the awe that first woman felt. We need to hold on to that and then talk about the reality of this was white-dominated, so that may not have felt the same for the second woman I brought up. And really nobody had thought about accessibility. And so that was also real. That same march is all of those things.
I think you offer this really useful concept of holding space in your book. Can you tell us what you mean by holding space?
What I mean by that is that obviously part of what makes a protest successful is that you get people in one spot. And you need those people there, whether that's in some cases 15 or 1.15 million. To really hold that space, particularly if you say only have, I know I'm thinking about one of the Women in Black demonstration I talk about the most, there was 8 people there. You have to also kind of transform the space in other ways. And part of that is just the intention people bring. And that's easier with a bigger group of people. Like it's easier if you've got a big group of people who can chant in unison when a speaker is talking, or who are moving together through a space with signs and singing or drumming. That kind of emotional engagement that happens in those spaces is also necessary to hold the space. So yes, you need those 8 or 1.15 million people, but you need that other kind of emotional engagement to make it a real presence, to really hold on to a space and transform it.
You were listening to Dr. Elizabeth Currans, Associate Professor of Women's and Gender Studies at Eastern Michigan University. She is the author of Marching Dykes, Liberated Sluts, and Concerned Mothers, Women Activists Transforming Public Space, published this year by the University of Illinois Press. You're very clear in your book that this isn't a social movement book, but rather a book about the public culture of protest, about the ways in which publics and concerned people come together to create this culture of activism. Do you think it's important that we view the women's marches, which are nearing the 1-year anniversary, in the same manner? It's not just about a social movement, but rather about a culture of protest.
I think I would say that those marches demonstrate that a social movement is happening, but that the marches themselves are not the social movement. And I think that protests can be a good indication that something is happening. But if we take back to the origin of the term social movement, which we tend to apply like, social movement X, social movement Y, we're talking about movement. We're talking about change. We're talking about that something is changing in society. And to me, the protests are evidence of that movement rather than the movement itself. And then to get back to your question a little bit more specifically, we also see this culture of activism or culture of protest that emerges in these spaces. And I think that can be really complicated. I mostly talk about the positive aspects of that in my book, because that ends up being the focus of how do different women-dominated groups transform spaces in ways that I think we need spaces to be transformed for cultural outsiders, even for short periods of time. What happened in January, pretty early on, someone who I don't think had much of an activist history was like, we need to have a women's march, which to me reflects engagement with what is a national ritual almost, which is to go march on Washington, something people have been doing for well over a century. The person who pitched this idea wasn't necessarily a seasoned organizer, which is why it was probably a good idea that some seasoned organizers said, hey, this is a great idea, let's come together and figure out how to do this well, and brought people together for another really large march, as well as some smaller marches around the country, which sounds like you were part of one in Santa Cruz. I was part of one here in Ypsilanti, Michigan.
It was the most people I had ever seen in Santa Cruz. People I couldn't even find the people I was supposed to go with. We were like, oh yeah, we'll meet in front of the library. Well, good luck. There was no way you were going to find people at the protest in Santa Cruz, which for a lot of us was kind of refreshing.
I helped plan the march here, and we expected 250 people. And we had been in the basement of a restaurant setting up because we were going to have a gathering afterwards with info tables and whatever. And we came out of the restaurant, and it was we had one megaphone, and there were well over 1,000 people there. And we were just completely overwhelmed. It was amazing.
Well, I think, I know some analysts were saying that at every single women's march in the country, we had underestimated the turnout in every single one, that the turnout had surpassed sort of our dreams. And I thought, what was so meaningful to me about the women's marches was sending a message to the world that we do not support this administration in any shape or fashion. Yeah. And we had to do that because I think the world thought we lost our minds.
And, I think it's going to be interesting to think through. I mean, because this administration is obviously misogynist, but it's also very homophobic and white supremacist, and the class politics. When we look at the tax bill, it's terrifying. What's interesting to me, and something I would like to think through further, is that the way we mobilize, despite the fact that this culture hates the word feminist, generally doesn't support women in a lot of different ways, but what brought people together, interestingly, was a women's march.
Right.
And it wasn't a march that, it was a very inclusive space. Like, there was a lot of men, a lot more men than most of the demonstrations I study. But that brought people together. Some people theorize that the most recent election was a result of backlash against progress. And when I look at, what happened at these marches in January 2017 up against the inauguration, it really gives credence to that idea that there's so much movement, so much momentum for change, that another set of people are terrified enough to elect someone who does not represent most of their interests either.
Right. They are terrified, and they helped elect someone terrifying, unfortunately. One of the points you write in the conclusion is, quote, being with each other in public is valuable for those of us who live and work in institutions and communities where we remain outsiders. And for me, that really applied to those of us in the academy who identify as scholar activists. And I raise this point because I think the academy has been sort of vilified as a breeding ground for revolution. And I wish, right? And so oftentimes, I see these pieces by conservative media regarding what the academy is like. And I don't know, even here at UC Santa Cruz, where that institution exists. It is fictitious. But I wondered, how do you understand scholar activism in your own life today, perhaps in comparison with when you were a graduate student at UC Santa Barbara?
Coming from the UC Santa Barbara, which was, I think there was a really robust organizing culture on that campus among graduate students and undergraduate students, and a few faculty who really supported that, but a very few. And then I'm here on a campus which is a predominantly commuter campus, where we're excited if students are able to come together and really do much of anything. Part of my answer comes from this really different kind of campus, where our students, work 30-plus hours a week and are taking full-time classes and are not really able to be as strong of activists as I was used to seeing. And so I think my role here does feel very different. And it's much more in the classroom than I imagined it to be. I think when I was a graduate student, I wanted to push for scholar activism to get outside of the classroom more. And I actually think that is the right thing in many circumstances. But what I've had to come to here is that given the students I'm working with, that my role in the classroom is much more important than I thought it was as a graduate student. And that giving students space to explore and to voice things they don't feel like they can voice other places, as well as to learn things that they don't learn other places, is really important. And then related to your comment earlier, I also have to do that in a place where the work that we do in women's and gender studies in general, we have to defend to the campus that this is really scholarship, that it is really teaching, that it isn't like, therapy sessions in class, that the objectivity is false in many circumstances, and that the idea that you can be totally neutral is a way that you can end up reinforcing existing hierarchies that negatively target all kinds of people, women, queer people, people of color, poor people, which on a campus like mine is almost every single student. So we do not have wealthy students here, or very few. In our incoming classes, we have 40% African-American students. We have a very high percentage of first-generation college students. And so I think to really support my students, being neutral can't really work, because being neutral would mean to say that the policies that are making it really hard for them to finish their college degrees have equal validity to their complaints.
Right, as if those policies are neutral. Their lived experience tells them, if maybe they don't have quite the analysis or the language for it, that in fact these policies are anything but neutral.
Right.
Thank you so much, Beth, for spending some time talking about your new book. I wonder if you have any final comments that you would like to share with our listeners.
And I guess to go back to that final part, thinking about that, it's important for us to think about where we are and to evaluate what it means to be in the place we're in, whether it's, Santa Cruz, California, or Ypsilanti, Michigan, and to really attend to these local places where we are and to know that the place where change can really happen is from where we are.
Well, thank you so much, Beth, for coming on the show. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for inviting me.